Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Kendall Hunt webinar, Human Trafficking, Bridging Practice and Academia, presented by Heather Zerberg-King, Bethany Gallo, and Leah Meyer. We're very excited that you're able to join us today for a discussion on this incredibly important topic. More and more what we're finding is that today's criminal justice students are expressing a desire to join the fight against human trafficking, which is wonderful, and we're blessed to have that. But sometimes that's tricky to do when there isn't always a super clear academic path to get there. So how do you facilitate this desire and help them fulfill that into a career? That is what our wonderful presenters are going to be helping us figure out today as they share their experience and their professional careers in the field. We highly encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will be saving them towards the end, but if it comes to mind, please feel free to throw it in either the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to work our way around to it. But before we get started, I would love to introduce our presenters. Heather Zerberg-King is a PhD in criminology and criminal justice. She's a previous intelligence analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and she's the program coordinator for the Certificate in Intelligence Studies at Mars Hill University, as well as being a government contractor. Bethany Gallo has worked with a litany of human trafficking organizations and was formerly the statewide human trafficking prevention director for Florida's child welfare and juvenile justice agencies. She has testified before U.S. Congress, Florida legislature, and more. And Leah Meyer has founded the executive director of the Human Trafficking Intelligence Project. She is a practitioner and a researcher with expertise in online exploitation, human trafficking investigations, victim outreach, and social network analysis. Well, I don't think it bears repeating, but we are so incredibly privileged to have you all with us today. We're so excited to hear from you and learn from your expertise. So without further ado, I will give the floor to you guys.
Hey, everybody. Again, just wanted to take an opportunity to thank all of you for joining, for having the interest and having the initiative to learn more about this and to come and sort of join us at the proverbial table to have discussions about what we can do to better understand and potentially mitigate human trafficking. You know, it's something that we're all very cognizant of. We understand, you know, the damage and the repercussions, you know, when we're looking at our society and the victims themselves. But sometimes the harder part is to figure out what we as an individual can do about it and how we can become engaged in that sort of realm to combat human trafficking. So just want to take an opportunity to let Bethany and Leah sort of talk a little bit more about their background, and then we're going to dive into some canned questions that will scope out more about our experience, how we got involved in human trafficking, you know, research, academia, and within the public and private sector. And then we will sort of pivot some to discussing how this textbook came about and sort of what we recommend, and whether it be through our own experience or research, sort of moving forward, how we can better impact, you know, this discussion moving forward and potentially, you know, save more individuals. So without further ado, Bethany, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Heather, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to engage in this conversation. So I currently serve as a consultant in the anti-human trafficking field and have been in that role for a handful of years now. We'll get to how I became engaged in the anti-trafficking field shortly, in a little bit of that background. But I, in my current role, have the opportunity to consult with primarily government agencies. I also do technical support with service providers who are directly serving those victims who have experienced trafficking, and a lot of work with state level agencies, child serving agencies, collaborative efforts, multidisciplinary efforts at the state level, and just building those integrative state level responses, as well as integrative ground level responses to the issue of trafficking. Anybody who's working in the field or educates on the field knows that this is a really complex issue where there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of needs. And so that is what I currently get to do. I also, on and off, get to teach a course on human trafficking in the School of Criminology at Florida State University. So I love bringing my field experience to that role, and it's especially special for me as a former graduate of the School of Criminology at Florida State University. So excited to see fellow educators here and to talk about this textbook, which in my opinion is really meeting a need in the field. And I'll turn it over to Leah. Sorry, Leah, about the late pitch, but there you go.
That's no problem at all. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you all. I look forward to your questions at the end. So a little bit about myself. I've been working in the anti-trafficking field for about 10 years. Where I've mainly focused on building technologies and using technologies to fight human trafficking. I started my career working for an NGO called Polaris, which runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I worked on the hotline for a number of years, taking calls from victims who are escaping dangerous situations and providing support to law enforcement, where I also helped to build the first text messaging hotline the victims used to communicate with us, to get in touch with law enforcement, and to connect with services. I later went on to work for DARPA, which is a government agency focused on building new technologies in numerous spaces. But they had a really interesting project that I worked on, focused on building technology to assist law enforcement identifying human trafficking online. I've recently started, actually back in 2018, I started the Human Trafficking Intelligence Project after I saw a gap in the knowledge around internet-enabled human trafficking and conducting survivor-centered investigations. Currently, I conduct on investigations and I work on a number of research projects for government agencies all around internet-enabled human trafficking. I will turn it back over to you, Heather.
All right, everyone. Again, my name is Heather Zerberg King. I am a former Florida State alumni as well. I completed my PhD in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. So we have kindred spirits associated through the FSU Knoll Association. Currently, I serve as an assistant professor at Mars Hill University. It's a Division II private institution just north of Asheville, North Carolina. When I first came to the school, there was a faculty of 3. We were just in the process of building a graduate program, and I pitched to our department chair, what if I brought to the table a certificate program? And I got the full endorsement and began the process of designing the curriculum for a certificate in intelligence studies. And that encompassed the design of a few new courses to include a human trafficking course. And this was one that I had been teaching previously, but it had really been something that I just put together and designed based on my own previous experience and sort of what the research was out in the field at the time. My former sort of practitioner background, while I was at FSU in the doctoral program, I also started working as an intel analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. In that capacity, I served in the organized crime and financial fraud units and found myself sort of being tapped by the director to learn more about human trafficking and what was happening within the state of Florida and sort of what policies were relevant to it, what resources were available, and what FDLE as an agency could be doing to be better engaged in that realm. And that led me to the opportunity to start doing some outreach and training with local employees and individuals working for the Leon County area, sort of indicators and signs to look for when they were out on their daily sort of job operations. I also had an opportunity to join up with some different task forces and took the chance to outreach to multiple fusion centers in the southeastern part of the United States and brought together a group of analysts that we all were seeing some of the similar trends in the southern part of the United States, but maybe weren't aware of what was happening next door. You know, we learn with human trafficking, it's not a sedentary crime. It's very mobile and it's easy, especially when there are groups that are conducting these acts. And so understanding what our state neighbors were experiencing and what groups were involved and sort of what the patterns were made it easier for us to potentially get ahead of those organized criminal acts. And so that was a great opportunity for me to sort of sink my teeth into it. And from there, I've taken an opportunity while I'm working at Mars Hill. I also do some contract work with the US government. I do a little bit of work within diplomatic security with the US Department of State. That doesn't have much overlap at this time with human trafficking. So a lot of what's gone into this textbook and a lot of experience that I pull from was from my time at FDLE. So looking forward to this. So glad again you guys are here, and don't hesitate to use that chat function for questions. As we go throughout, we will have sort of an opportunity at the end to circle back and answer those. So I guess I will go ahead and sort of proctor some of these canned questions and let Bethany and Leah work through them. And sort of as I wrap up the final leg of the responses, pivot to the next questions as we go through them. So first question to the panelists, tell us how you got involved in efforts to combat human trafficking and give a little bit of background about those experiences.
So I have been lucky enough to get to serve in a variety of different anti-trafficking specific roles throughout my entire career. I started in the anti-trafficking field and have continued my work in that field. And my entering into it was a bit of luck and fate, and of course, interest in intersecting in similar populations. As I mentioned before, I graduated with my master's in criminology from Florida State. I was one of those lucky folks that graduated right in the middle of the recession. And so jobs were very limited coming out of school at that time in the early 2000s. And so I actually started out in a volunteer role. I was really interested. I focused on at-risk youth populations, prevention of delinquency, and studies along those veins while in school. So I was really interested in at-risk youth populations and advocacy work. And so I started volunteering at a child advocacy center, and that child advocacy center happened to be one of the first to have a program specific to youth who had experienced commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. And so it wasn't too long before I was working in a full-time role in that child advocacy center within the anti-trafficking program, where I got to do a lot of direct advocacy work with 12 to 18-year-old, primarily females, who had experienced sex trafficking. So that involved a lot of, at that point, there were so few anti-trafficking specific agencies that any of those that were doing the work were doing everything. So it was a lot of direct court advocacy, victim advocacy as they navigated the criminal justice system as a victim witness. A lot of the youth, we were still arresting for prostitution at the time in Florida, unfortunately. And so a lot of youth were being arrested. And so it was also advocating through their delinquency processes. Many were also child welfare involved. And so navigating all of these systems that were involved in our kids' lives, and just being alongside to support and empower them as they exited trafficking and started on their healing and recovery journey. So that is a bit of how I got involved. I'm really thankful for that origin story, and because it led me later to a policy role, which I felt like every day I was able to pull on and use the experiences I had learned in direct service, providing advocacy services. So what I learned about what it's like for our kids as they navigate the criminal justice processes, to sit in law enforcement investigation interviews, and what that feels like as a youth, to have to advocate in court for yourself, whether that's dependency or delinquency court, and what that experience is like for our youth. And so when I was able to move into policy roles in the child serving agencies like juvenile justice and child welfare, I really was able to pull on that advocacy and think about how the impact of the policies that we are creating and practices that we are creating, what will that have on our youth, and how can we best create policy that is nuanced enough to really meet the needs of this complex issue. So that's a little bit about how I got involved. I've just really lucked out in I wanted to do advocacy work. I found a way to do it in a volunteer role. It happened to end me up end up being in an anti-trafficking role, and thankful for it ever since.
Should I go for it? So I got involved in human trafficking. Actually, it's very pertinent to this textbook because my interests actually started in college. So when I was in school, human trafficking was primarily approached from a gendered perspective. There was very little talk about labor trafficking. The focus was very much on sex trafficking of women and girls, but there was no class on human trafficking when I was doing my undergraduate degree. Luckily, so I majored in history, sociology, and women's studies. And I think that women and gender studies was actually played probably the biggest role in my career trajectory because it was that focus. In a couple of my classes, it came up as a topic of discussion, and it just kind of piqued my interest. And I got really involved in reading about lots of different people's perspectives on human trafficking. And I remember confiding in a professor and saying that, I'm really interested in this topic. It seems so egregious. Like I can't understand how this happens in the world. And it really kind of, and this will kind of go into the next question that when I talk a little bit more later about parts of the textbook that I wrote, it really did influence how her answers really influenced how I approached the subject matter, because she was very measured in her response and really helped me to, directed me to resources about inequality and vulnerability and, systemic problems that contribute to exploitation. And I think that was really centering for me and really helped me to gain a good perspective. I think that there's a lot of, influence on, sometimes I think in schools, it can get really sensationalized. And I think that having that measured perspective was really important and helped me to focus how I approach the subject. And she was a great mentor. She helped me to put together a research proposal, and I did my research on human trafficking, my undergraduate research on different policy and legal analysis. And I actually focused on trafficking in military conflicts, which was very enlightening, but it was really through her guidance that I got involved as I did. And I feel like that's probably very similar to many of your students. So I'm happy to answer more questions about it if you have any particular students, but yeah, this textbook was definitely for me when I was an undergrad. So I'm very excited that I could contribute to it. And really give my perspective growing in the field.
That's awesome. I am kind of the opposite side, right? I had no exposure or experience to human trafficking coming up through college. Really wasn't a specific course. It was after college when I was at Florida Department of Law Enforcement that it was complete happenstance that the director probably just looked at me and went, "You're a smart girl. You should be able to figure this out." And when I started looking at the policy parts of what was available and what legislation specifically to the state of Florida, allocated and what the penalties and sanctions looked like, that started giving me a better understanding and also made it very clear that there were still a lot of issues that needed to be worked through, as far as being able from that law enforcement side to identify trafficking versus, prostitution, and how to sort of handle those situations in a delicate manner, right? Understanding that there is a victim element to it at that point. And so that really changes sort of how you approach questioning and engagement with those individuals. And for me, it really kind of stuck in is when there were a couple situations related to missing juveniles in the panhandle of Florida. And I had a chance to link up and work with Class Kids, which is an organization that, utilized elements of social media to help identify and potentially locate, individuals that had gone missing. And after linking up with them, I started becoming a lot more savvy to, sort of the multi-level dimension of trafficking, and that it wasn't as clean and as simple, like we say, as the movies and as it's made to seem when we read news reports. So that was very eye-opening for me, for someone who really didn't have any, research or academic background previously. It sort of came to me from that hands-on practitioner side of things. And as I became more versed in it, more cases started coming and more coordination with other agencies. And then sort of came the element of, now that I have a better understanding of what those gaps are, and maybe I can put that back to them, meaning put together training to help enlighten individuals to look for those indicators, what things to look for, and not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. There are county officials and parks and recs individuals that every day potentially stumble across indicators of labor and sex trafficking. And if we aren't in a position to educate them what those indicators look like, then they may walk right past those without even thinking twice, or recognizing that that is something that they should potentially refer on to law enforcement, or maybe even just ask a few questions. And the same thing in the medical field. There's a huge opportunity with indicator training and awareness in the medical field and the hotel industry, all of these sectors that, sort of are used without their knowledge many times to facilitate trafficking. And the more we can do on the outreach and the training side, I think really, really is where a lot of impact is. But we'll get more to that later. I will go ahead. We'll jump to our next question. And that essentially gets us to talking a little bit about the textbook specifically and the contributions that each of you have made. And were there any areas, any topics that were specifically significant to you or specifically personal to you? Bethany, I'm going to take that one first.
Sure. So Heather and I mean, it's been mentioned, we met actually when we were both working in those state agencies. So when she was at FDLE and I was working in, I believe it was juvenile justice at the time. So it was, great to get to work together in those roles and be a part of that early response within the state of Florida. And so when she told me she was writing a textbook, I was really excited to get involved and engaged in this effort. I didn't mention this in my intro. There were no classes on human trafficking, to my knowledge, in any of the schools, with the exception of maybe the law school at Florida State when I was in school. So I had not heard of human trafficking until I happened in my role as a youth advocate within that child advocacy center. And so and having that perspective of not having had that in school, and later now having been able to teach a human trafficking course in the field of criminology, I know that it's a huge gap, still a huge gap, especially a textbook specifically taking the angle of investigation and intelligence around human trafficking. So I was able to contribute to mostly to the discussions around efforts to identify and serve youth within those child serving agencies, juvenile justice in particular. As I've kind of touched on, Florida was one of the earlier states to, and there's so many states doing great work. And I think that that's always a great thing to weave into classes, is what's going on in your state and local area. I think it's really engaging for students. And I was excited to get to talk about the work Florida's done in my courses. But there's, so I got to have a chance to outline some of that work and talk about some of the specific examples, how we did early research on efforts to identify youth in these populations, the development of a screening tool in the state of Florida to identify children and youth, and outline some of those efforts. And I also just had a chance to do review of other areas, provide some additional resources, some great resources that have been developed by lived experience experts, survivors in our field. Just it was great to get to contribute with that policy lens that I like to bring to every table that I sit at, because if you haven't noticed yet, I love policy and the word policy. And so it was fun to get to contribute that lens and to highlight some of the efforts that have been done to really support youth who have experienced trafficking, both sex and labor. And I'll turn it over to Leah. I'm sorry, Leah. I will better transition on question number 3. I apologize, audience.
I will also start this by talking about when I met Heather. So I wrote the chapters on social media and online escort ads and sex buyer review forums. And I met Heather when I believe it was at a conference that I was presenting some of the DARPA research, some of our tools for law enforcement, and she was one of the law enforcement there. So we have this connection over investigations, and really it is a very personal thing for me, because I've spent so much of my career really focused on finding ways to how traffickers exploit technology, but also helping others in the field of anti-trafficking to use technology to fight human trafficking. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. And it's been such a big part of my career on both sides, because it is such a help, but it's also so detrimental in other ways. So the chapters that I wrote were really, what I've spent so much of my career on. So I invested a lot of my blood, sweat, and tears is all represented there. And I think it's some of the most, I think that, students are very interested in it because they are so literate in technology, and they very much understand the social media environment, where, that was a very big struggle for me when I was doing technical assistance for many law enforcement agents, struggling to kind of understand the landscape and, how to find traffickers on Instagram. And, it's not their native environment where it is for students. So I think that they're very engaged on the issue and really want to, set it on their own and to do investigations on their own, and which comes with its own dangers, which I will also talk about. But I think that students are very engaged, and it's very, once they know that the issue is there, they are very aware of it, which I think is also just such an important part of understanding how to fight human trafficking, is just knowing that it's there, because there are so many misconceptions, and there are so many it's in hiding in plain sight, is what people always say, which I think is true. The technology piece, I think, is so important, because it is where we are having so many of our political and moral debates about just being online, what life is like online. There's so much, the space is constantly evolving, and it's very complicated because it gets into debates of surveillance, free speech, sex work, and content moderation. All of those kind of blend together online. So it is a very difficult place to educate and, talk about disinformation and misconceptions and other things like that. But I think that that was kind of my goal in the chapters that I contributed to, was to really lay it out in a way that is teachable, because it is so complicated, and it will only really get more complicated from here, because it's constantly evolving. And that's also why it's very interesting. So, given that there are so many misconceptions and risks in the space, it can be difficult to teach. And like I said, students are motivated to jump on it and to do their own investigating. So I think it's a big part of the lens with which I contributed to these chapters, was really focused on understanding and having awareness of what you're seeing online, but also knowing that engaging with potential traffickers or victims online, that's a person there, and there's a potential danger or risk in doing that, engaging with that. So there's a big part of the big part of the textbook, I feel like, is focused too on kind of informing students about the risks that they can take with getting involved in things that law enforcement should be involved in. And so a big part of that is really talking about when to report things, when to just knowing the steps to take after you're seeing an incident happen in person or online or things like that. So that's the lens with which I approached much of my work.
Yeah, I will admit, Leah and I have had many conversations throughout the process, trying to find that fine line between what is informative versus what's giving too much information that potentially makes it dangerous. So I feel like we finally walked away at a good balance where students feel like they're getting some granular level information. It's sort of how it really looks and how it operates, but not to the extent or not to the skill set where they can go out themselves and actually do it. Because the last thing we want is to put the students in a situation where they're out there and not really understanding, like Leah said, the gravity of it, and get themselves engaged in a situation that's dangerous, either additionally, traumatic for the victim or dangerous by being in front of a trafficker themselves. So it was definitely a work that took some fine tuning, but Leah was the first person I went to and said, how do we make this happen? Because I knew her skill set would be able to find that fine line and carve it out. So I appreciate all of the work that she put into it for sure. Then I would probably say for me, one of the more sort of significant sections in the textbook, I would say, is the analytical part, is that coming from the Intel analyst chapter. And I'll probably always be an Intel analyst at heart. I'm always looking to pull threads and trying to put together the bigger network, the bigger understanding of the organization, what are the implications, the connections. Some of the most enjoyable time I had when I was working as an analyst at FDLE was working the social network analysis. And a few of them were human trafficking related. It all started from a newspaper article where there was a traffic stop and we got a couple names. And then from there it spun out and I was requesting, field stop reports and police reports and running financials and bios and businesses and trying to look at the bigger picture, finding out where the associates were and what that movement looked like. Because before you know it, you went from a single field stop with an individual driver to now you've got 14 different individuals, you've got multiple countries involved, you've got finances moving. So you've evolved yourself from a singular incident to an entire network. And all that does is make it easier for the actual officers and investigators and detectives to go out there and close that and find all of the offenders, not just opposed to the single one who was driving the vehicle. So for me, it's always fun to circle back to that Intel analysis part and try to, see what the bigger picture is and how can we potentially, make a bigger impact as opposed to that singular entity. And I find that students find it fascinating through the certificate program, through the human trafficking textbook, through the course I teach. It's amazing to me at the end of every semester, students walk away going, I had no idea. I had no idea this was an issue. I had no idea trafficking was in my backyard. And I had no idea that, there are tools and software and even careers out there that focus on, not just arresting the bad guy, being a homicide detective, but the analyst doing the work behind the scenes. And that really is rewarding to me and sort of was one of the driving forces behind taking all this information, pulling together all of these people I know from these fabulous walks of life, all sort of trying to get to that same end result and putting this together and fashioning it in a textbook, with that lens of more of a criminal justice, more of an investigations, intelligence line, but also starting from the foundation, and incorporating all the essentials and necessary elements for someone who's never experienced any coursework or research in trafficking to walk away and feel like they've kind of got that comprehensive understanding of what the threats look like and potential options for how to mitigate it. So that for me, the whole process has been very fulfilling. But like I said, I always come back to being an analyst is who I am and it's what I'm very good at. And it's something that I always sort of, when I'm talking to students about trafficking, find myself talking to them from that lens of an analyst and how we can do bigger and do better and really dig in and pull all those threads out. So that's been sort of the rewarding part of this whole process, as well as being able to work with these fantastic individuals and many others who were contributing to different aspects of the textbook. I definitely pulled and called on a lot of people from different walks of life to add bits and pieces and add their expertise to certain sections. I wanted this book to be comprehensive. I wanted it to be accurate, and I wanted it to be something that was cutting edge, sort of up to date on the technology, on the vernacular, on the trends and the policies moving forward. So when students read it, they didn't feel like this was old and outdated, that they really felt like this was something that they could take with them and take to their career or to their next step in life. So I will go ahead. This is our last question that we sort of had for canned. So I bring this to you, ladies. What do you think is an area? I know that there are many, but just kind of focusing on one that you think will make the biggest impact in our efforts to address human trafficking.
So at the risk of sounding like I'm pandering to our audience and the co-presenters, I think education is really an area that is going to make a huge impact. We are still really early in education at the university and college level that is taking the focus areas and skill sets that our students are bringing, an interest that students are bringing into their field of study, whether that's criminology, public health, social work, many of the fields that human trafficking courses are starting to enter into, and having that foundational area of study and then adding this really nuanced conversation around a very complex crime into that foundational knowledge that students have built. I think it's really important. I myself entered into the field with none of that information, and I would have been much better equipped had I come out having had some understanding of what human trafficking looks like in the United States, what domestic minor sex trafficking specifically looks like, and in both the victimization aspect, but also from the advocacy and support and recovery side, understanding the similarities to intimate partner violence, where there's a frequent or often a return to the perpetrator, and that kind of similar intersection there, understanding some of the intersections to sexual assault and some of the violence that that in particular sex trafficking victims have experienced in that way, but also labor trafficking victims often experience sexual assault and their labor trafficking victimization during that period as well. And so I think it's incredible that that students will have the opportunity. I love Misty's, thank you for adding your thoughts into the chat. I love that kids are interested in engaging in anti-trafficking material, who are interested in going a lot of different paths. That was one of the things I stressed to my criminology students when I was teaching the course, is you can do so much with your criminology degree, and there's so many different ways you can go, and there is so many different ways you can support the anti-trafficking work and efforts, whether that's in direct advocacy, direct service advocacy with people who've experienced trafficking, or in policy work, or in law enforcement. There's so many ways, and I just think it's incredible that we are educating, especially with all the myths and misconceptions out there about human trafficking. I think it's really incredible that we're taking entire semesters to address a really complex topic with nuance and with the intentional focus on keying into what youth or kids, college students, they're probably adults, are what they're already studying. They already have a foundational knowledge of criminology, criminal justice, law enforcement efforts, intelligence, and investigations. So building on that knowledge within the human trafficking lens. So thank you to educators. Thank you to textbooks writers, because I just think education is really going to be huge in helping our field advance in from a much more robust knowledge base.
My answer is similar but broader. I had take the same perspective. I really think that society-wide awareness of human trafficking will make the biggest impact. I think that in some of I'm working in foreign policy right now, and I see some of the awareness campaigns that make a huge difference on the ground in just individuals knowing how to protect themselves, and just knowing that there are bad actors out there who may try to recruit them. There are intimate partners who may try to exploit them. I think that we need to continue to push awareness campaigns and really ground them with people. And I think that this is, if this textbook makes a difference in one student's life, like, it will be an accomplishment. Just being able to, not only teach these students how to, have careers in anti-trafficking, even if someone who is maybe in an abusive relationship takes this class and reads this book and thinks, I'm being exploited, or I have a friend who's being exploited, or I know what to do in the future if I see human trafficking happening, or and really understanding it, not just knowing a lot of the myths that are out there, but really being able to identify it and take the appropriate actions. I think that really creates the knowledge kind of it perpetuates itself. It will make a difference in people's lives. And I think that that's really the most important thing, because it's the prevention that we are not, truly, we're getting so much better at investigations, at identifying victims, but the preventing trafficking, I think, is the most difficult piece. And if we can educate, college students on human trafficking, and they can educate others on what they learn, or if it just helps them, then I think that we've done, we're getting started on the prevention side. But I think that we need to continue to focus on helping people to understand if they're at risk and what to look out for.
So I would definitely dovetail on the training part, on the awareness piece. I think one of the best things that states have started doing with statutory requirements with their BLET courses, the basic law enforcement training courses, is requiring, so many hours of human trafficking focused, instruction. I think that's a fantastic step in the right direction. I think that also is something, many college students, end up, especially in the criminal justice major, they graduate and then they find themselves at BLET. So many students, right, graduating from Florida State College of Crim, then they find themselves that next semester, year at Pat Thomas, going through basic law enforcement training. And like I said, having the statutory element behind it, requiring the training to make sure that all of these individuals that are going to be embarking in sworn law enforcement careers from day one, from step one out of the academy, they've had that sort of focused attention on trafficking, what to look for. Hopefully, if the training is comprehensive, they're talking about victim-centered, approaches to interviewing and engaging with them. That just carries so much impact. One of the coolest things I had happen at the end of one of my human trafficking courses, even at Mars Hill, was a couple of students come to me and say that they experienced this through friends of theirs when they were back in high school. And wouldn't it be beneficial for them to do some type of outreach with the local schools? And shouldn't the kids at the local schools know what to look for? And I went 100%, I agree with you. So they actually started working through the community engagement program at the university to design sort of human trafficking indicators, but structured down that it could be sort of understood by middle schoolers. Where to go, what to look for, how somebody on social media might engage with you. That could be a warning, what to do if you see it, who to go talk to, and not to be embarrassed by it, not to be ashamed by it. Sometimes it happens and you don't realize it, and then your friend knows about it, and it needs to be that conversation of, well, we need to go talk to somebody. We need to go tell someone, because if we don't say something, it will happen to someone else, right? Because the recruitment process just continues. So I think that for me, the biggest impact definitely comes in that education awareness, I think from the law enforcement side, through the BLET, and also through the schools. This book will, sort of funnel and focus on the collegiate level, and it goes into a lot more detail and sometimes a little bit, crass as far as the content. There are images that, come from social media that sometimes aren't the most pleasing, but that is part of understanding the gravity of this crime. Now, if we want to go and we want to present this to high school and middle school students, we would revamp that and sort of sanitize it. But it still would have so much impact, I think, for the parents to understand what to look for on their child's social media and internet behaviors, and then also for the kids themselves before they get pulled into it. So we've definitely got a long way to go, but I think that we are certainly making steps. And I hope that we can continue to, from all avenues that we come from in the work and academic and in the public sector, continue to facilitate that education, awareness, and outreach part. And I think that will make a huge difference.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for just sharing your knowledge with us, your experience. It was really, really enlightening, and we very much appreciate it. We've got quite a few comments and questions in the audience. And one of them is, what legislation do you guys think would have the most impact for human trafficking? There's some frustration about wanting prosecutors to be more aggressive. Amy says, I work for law enforcement. It's been really frustrating when prosecutors will not take our cases. Rarely do we have victims agreeing to testify due to their trauma, but I feel like prosecutors could be more creative with the law. So yeah, kind of that, from your guys' experience, if there was a piece of legislation that would make it easier to prosecute, what would that be?
This is definitely a tough one. This is not a beginner level question.
I'm sure there's lots of nuance involved in it.
I think in regards to, just to touch on the prosecutor piece, I mean, this has been a big debate, I know, for many years. The coercion part of the law that specifies coercion, it's very difficult to prove. And even when there's evidence of force and fraud, which are a little bit, you can have some kind of documentation and sometimes with those pieces, but so much of the trafficking law and so much of it, how it actually happens in cases with coercion is incredibly difficult. So I know that piece is very, very hard, especially when you don't have victim testimony. That does make cases so difficult. And that's actually some of the research that I have worked on in the escort ad space, is trying to overcome that, to validate what human trafficking looks like online, to be able to more readily prove it without having a victim present. It's something that I think a lot of people are trying to overcome, and it's incredibly difficult. So I understand, there's a lot of, many prosecutors will only take, the cases that are really strong because they don't want to lose them, but either way, human trafficking is a very difficult crime to prosecute, which is why so many turn to other charges to prosecute under. But this is certainly not my area of expertise, so I'll turn it over. I'll just comment on that part and turn it back to Heather and Bethany.
I think you made a really good point. I do think state definitions of trafficking, of course, vary from state to state as far as how they define trafficking. I think being in line with the federal definitions of trafficking is really important, and just making sure there's clarity and understanding what, especially coercion, what coercion means, and what are elements of coercion. And I would struggle to pick one specific. If I was developing legislation, it would be this huge, probably 200-page bill, including all the things I think you would need to really impact an increase in prosecutions, or with certain things focused, making sure that there is no statute of limitations or a very long statute of limitations. We have folks that are a lot of survivors are not ready to engage in investigations against their traffickers, and some are, but right off the bat. So ensuring there's a reasonable amount of time for them to develop that readiness, making sure there's lots of victim protections in place, especially for child victims, but for all victims, whether that is, the ability to do closed circuit, television testimony or things along those lines, the ability to, I've heard, a prosecutor should really, in a lot of trafficking cases, should treat it more like a homicide case where there is no victim, and have just more innovative approaches, which isn't a legislative solution. That's a law enforcement strategic approach. But I do think there has to be really comprehensive legislation that supports the prosecution of these cases, from clear definitions of what trafficking is, clear ability to instruct jurors on what trafficking is, clear protections for those advocating with trafficking survivors. There were no such protections when I was advocating, so I could get subpoenaed to testify against my clients, which is obviously not a ideal position to be placed in. And so, a lot of things that go into just a really victim-centered approach to investigations and prosecutions that provide the time, space, and understanding of the needs and of the victim, and offering protections where you can. So that was not a very straight answer, because there's lots of things needed, but I do think that's a few things to throw out there as suggestions. And education. Legislation requiring education for law enforcement and criminal justice stakeholders as a whole.
I think any legislation dedicating more money to victim services would also be welcome.
See, we've got a couple other questions here. When teaching human trafficking, do you guys have any prerequisites for your course?
I do not. I run it as like a 300 level course. And it's right on that cusp. The expectation is that it's an upper level elective course. I don't require any prereqs. I get a multitude of students from interdisciplinary avenues. Typically, my course is comprised of CJ, but more so social work, psychology, sociology, some business, and a decent number of nursing students as well. So I try not to do a prereq, only because I feel like that might hinder sort of some of that interdisciplinary brilliance that I get from having students from all those different avenues.
And same exact answer. I second all of that. I haven't had any nursing students. That's awesome, but no prereqs, and it's been very interdisciplinary, and I think that's fantastic.
We have an anonymous question. What would human trafficking cases look like? Can you guys give an example?
What would it look like? Oh, geez, that's like a very large question. There's a lot of cases from, you can take this from a labor trafficking avenue, you can take it from a sex trafficking. I'll just kind of jump into an example from the labor trafficking, since, that tends to sometimes not get as much attention. Many of times, their hospitality industry, the illicit massage business line, we see individuals that are being brought over either from another country, or they are in a vulnerable situation here in this country, and somebody offers them a job opportunity. They hold their identification documentation, garnish wages. Many of times we see them being picked up and dropped off from workplaces. Sometimes they actually all live in one place, whether it be a house or a rental, a townhouse, and it's a multitude of mattresses, all kind of in an open area. This is kind of what some people refer to as a flop house. There's been a couple nail salons in the panhandle of Florida that were labor trafficking employees. And when the house was discovered, there were about 14 mattresses all in the common area, which we would have as our living room and dining room. It was a small little hot plate next to each mattress with a small bag that had each of their personal effects. And aside from that, it was the sheets that they slept on, and the clothes that they wore is the clothes that they had. And they all shared that facility. That was where they lived, kind of against their will, obviously, wages being garnished and not having identification to leave. So it was a situation where, no, they were not being forced into sexual services, but they were being forced into labor services and being, in essence, held against their will, right? Because for them, many of times we see a language barrier as well. So whether it be that they're not from this country, or they haven't been here very long and they don't have resources to go talk to someone, it could be that they're threatened, that family members are threatened. So there's a multitude of things done sort of on that coercion level that are difficult to prove and difficult because they're not so tangible, but they are absolutely happening. And there's a lot of psychological and emotional impact and victimization happening to those people. And much of that is sort of the trauma that they're experiencing, not physically, but internally.
And I'd just like to add, I think it's important to note that human trafficking cases can look like a lot of things. There is so much, and especially important to note with there are so many myths and misconceptions out there, and this is a really complex issue. And there are, human trafficking could look like youth trading sex and for a safe place to stay. It could look like a child being, familial trafficking is often overlooked, but there is, that's because it often involves younger children, harder to identify in that scenario, really difficult from an investigative and service standpoint to address. That could be a young child being sold amongst people that family unit is interconnected with within a neighborhood. That could look similar in a gang situation as well. There's so many different ways that that human trafficking could manifest, and you could even have an entire trafficking experience occurring online, where the entire point of exploitation is happening through online, through coercive mechanisms happening there, and the child or young adult is never leaving their home. And so and it could look like things that we see represented in media more often, of severe cases of domestic servitude and isolation, and cases like that were more of the sensational types of cases we see. But there's such a range of cases that are considered human trafficking.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to not stereotype cases, because they can really, human trafficking is such a broad crime. And that's also what makes it such an interesting topic to study, because it does manifest in so many different ways. And I think probably the most common that I've seen is, I'm seeing more webcam based exploitation now due to the pandemic. And that can be both, children and adults. But, I think that in my time conducting investigations, a majority of what I've seen has just been individual, what most people would see as a domestic violence relationship. Intimate partner violence and human trafficking go hand in hand frequently. And I think that that's what I've seen the most of.
Right. Well, are there any other questions today? We've got quite a bit of comments in the chat function, but just to respect the privacy of those who are sharing experiences, I'm going to keep it to direct questions today. Are there any others that we have? Kind of the ones I have is, you guys have talked a lot about a lot of the misconceptions behind human trafficking. What are some of the ones that you frequently experience?
The most that I see are frequently the confusion between human trafficking and human smuggling. That gets confused a lot in media, and amongst some law enforcement and others in the anti-trafficking field, I think can sometimes confuse the two. And I really like to separate them, understanding that human trafficking is a crime against a person, human smuggling is a crime against a border. So that's oftentimes how I like to keep it simple that way. But they can be related. One can lead to another, but they are separate crimes. And so that's the biggest one that I see. The second is probably that human trafficking that happens overseas. That doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen in my town. That happens somewhere else. That happens to other people, and that's just not true. I've seen human trafficking happening in every city in the United States, in rural communities, in urban communities, sex and labor trafficking. It happens everywhere. So those are probably the two big ones that I see in my work.
I see, I second those. I see those a lot as well as the misconception that trafficking victims, especially in sex trafficking, are women and girls. A lot of the early language on trafficking, both internationally and in the United States, was specific to women and girls. And so making sure that we understand that men and boys are also victims of all forms of trafficking. And the other misconception, and this could be a whole webinar in and of itself, is that that all sex work is by choice, and that includes for children. I have heard and seen responses along those lines, that is particularly relevant for adults, that those that are engaged in sex work and prostitution all want to be engaged in sex work and prostitution, and that kind of societal belief and normalizing of certain institutions trickles down to kids as well. And so that's another misconception I would say, is that those two things are always the same, or that trafficking doesn't really exist because all sex work is by choice. So that's another misconception I see. There's so many misconceptions out there, but that's a couple of them.
Yeah, I would say the biggest one that the college students that I instruct come across is the whole Taken effect, right? They've all seen the movie Taken. They all see Liam Neeson chasing international waters to go save his daughter. And many of them think that human trafficking is not a local thing, right? That it's not happening in their neighborhood or in their area. And so for me, a lot of it is starting out by debunking the international phenomenon of it and bringing it local. And so I usually always have, unfortunately, plenty to pull from, but at the beginning of every semester, here's a host of articles from Asheville and Charlotte Mecklenburg and even Madison County, of trafficking that has been in this area in the last 12 to 14 months. And that for them is kind of the scene setter to establish that this is not just something outside your reach. It's happening around you, with you, within the communities you grew up. And that for them really kind of sets a good perspective for the course and gives them a little bit better frame of reference as we start diving into like understanding and learning about trafficking and the different elements.
And then in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and just take one more question tonight. What do you guys feel should be done in terms of prosecuting the bottom girl? And maybe that's a term that will need to be defined, but it says every situation is different, but oftentimes the bottom girl is the most vicious in the enterprise over time. What's your experience with that?
I actually got to work with a group to develop a whole toolkit on victim offender intersectionality, which is the term I try to use for that particular phenomenon, since they are victims and offenders. Can you all hear me okay? My AirPods just died mid-conversation, so here we go. I'm happy to share that resource. We have email addresses out there if you want to send me your email. It's for all criminal justice stakeholders on how to approach and address victim intersectionality. That, of course, is a spectrum on its own, and there's, levels of culpability and victimization along that spectrum that need to be addressed, because, of course, there has to be balance on providing justice to those victimized, but also recognition of the victimization that that person is concurrently or has previously experienced. And so happy to share that toolkit with anybody interested.